Rockstar's Red Dead Redemption 2 is the undisputed king of Wild West games, with a richly detailed storyline that's full of interesting events, but those of you who have only played the second game might not understand some of the hidden narrative threads that tie into the original Red Dead Redemption. And while RDR2 does have some beautifully animated cutscenes to tell its main story, it doesn't go out of its way to explain the underlying lore. That's left up to you, the player, to explore by yourself. Finding all of the hidden journals, notes, and references can be a tiresome process here, and I understand that most of you don't have the time or patience for something like that, which is why I've made this video to give you the full, untold story of Red Dead Redemption 2. Confused about stuff like the Blackwater Heist or Dutch's relationship with the O'Driscoll gang? Don't worry, because I'll tell you exactly about what happened. Once you piece together everything here, you'll gain a much deeper understanding and appreciation for the depth of RDR2's plot. So without further ado, let's get started. Red Dead Redemption's story begins in the period we now know as the Wild West, when cowboys, prospectors, and outlaws began their expansion to the west of the Mississippi River after the end of the American Civil War. And this was a time of great adventure, when men risked everything they had to move westward in hopes of making it big. The wild frontier was being settled by pioneers, who'd often established their own brand of law and order at the end of a rifle barrel. Midday shootouts, duels, raids, heists, and robberies were common in this part of the country, and the federal government was trying its best to keep things civilized. But there was only so much they could do with their limited manpower in uncharted territory, and soon we observed the rise of outlaw gangs. One of these was the infamous Van der Linde gang, founded in 1877 by Dutch Van der Linde and Hosea Matthews. If you paid attention during the story, you probably know that Dutch isn't a big fan of Southerners. That's because his father, an immigrant from the Netherlands, was killed by the Confederates during the American Civil War, and after his father's death, Dutch grew to be cold and resentful of people, and his mother failed to rein in his more destructive tendencies. One day, at the age of 15, Dutch ran away from home, leaving his widowed mother alone. From the beginning, Dutch's ideals were centered around living a free and independent life. You could even say that he was a bit of a loner, and since he was a teenager with no skills, he resorted to a life of crime. In the mid-1870s, Dutch came across a young Hosea Matthews who was a con artist. The two rested at a campfire on the way to Chicago, and Hosea tried to con and steal from Dutch, only to realize that Dutch had also stolen from him. Impressed by each other's skills, the two con men laughed it off and decided that they should travel together as partners. This marked the foundation of the Van der Linde gang. As their first criminal act, Dutch and Hosea pretended to be foreign merchants and deceived 12 Ohio citizens into buying $300 worth of shares for a fictional Portuguese company. They were caught, but they did manage to escape from prison. That very same year, in 1877, during their travels, Dutch and Hosea found a 14-year-old orphan on the streets. His name was Arthur Morgan. Arthur's mother had died of unknown causes when he was a small child, and his father was an outlaw. At the age of only 11, Arthur saw his father hang for committing larceny. One interesting detail about Arthur is that he wears a black hat, typically associated with bad guys in traditional Western movies. This is actually his father's hat, which he kept after his father's death. Dutch and Hosea told Arthur how to read, write, shoot, and ride a horse. He was Dutch's first protege and one of the founding members of the Van der Linde gang. During the same time, Dutch developed a romantic relationship with Susan Grimshaw, who you might recognize as the caretaker of the Van der Linde gang in Red Dead Redemption 2. Later, he broke up with her, and he became quite fond of a woman called Annabelle. Remember her name. She's going to play a pivotal role later in the story. Several years later, in 1885, the gang came across a 12-year-old boy in Illinois who was about to be hanged by an angry mob for stealing from them. That boy's name was John Marston, and he had already shot a man to death just 1 year prior. Dutch rescued him from the angry crowd and taught him many useful skills, just like he did with Arthur. Dutch steered John away from his primal and violent nature, teaching him to value things other than power. Over time, John was heavily influenced by Dutch's worldview and believed that they fought and killed for a reason, although it wasn't quite clear as to what that reason actually was. By the year 1893, the gang had recruited various other members like Bill Williamson, Uncle, Pearson, Josiah Trelawney, Sean McGuire, Leopold Strauss, Mary Beth, Tilly Jackson, as well as Karen Jones. In 1894, Uncle introduced the gang to a prostitute by the name of Abigail Roberts. She had sexual relations with several of the gang members, but took a particular liking towards John Marston, and the two of them formed a romantic relationship. Soon after, Abigail did become pregnant, but John ran away as he couldn't accept responsibility for a child, insisting that the kid may not even be his. In 1895, Dutch recruited a Mexican exile called Javier Escuela while stealing some chickens, and this man would later prove himself to be one of Dutch's most loyal gunmen. John returned a year later in 1897, and Arthur was quite distrustful of him, viewing him as a selfish person as well as a coward for neglecting his fatherly duties. Matters were only made worse by the fact that Dutch forgave John almost immediately, which Arthur saw as an act of leniency as well as favoritism. For a while after this, relations between John and Arthur remained tense, with neither wanting to be around the other guy. Sometime during the 1890s, we don't know exactly when from the story, but Dutch ran into another gangster by the name of Colm O'Driscoll. The two of them formed an uneasy truce, but it was clear from the beginning that Dutch disliked the way Colm treated his men as expendable assets. Meanwhile, Colm felt that Dutch's ideals of freedom and trying to create a better world were nothing but meaningless platitudes and a mask for his true intentions. While Dutch was an idealistic dreamer, Colm was a ruthless survivor. Eventually, the two clashed against each other and Dutch killed Colm's brother, and as revenge, Colm killed Annabelle, Dutch's love.
I liked Annabelle.
This began a long-lasting blood feud between the two gangs. In 1898, while traversing the Grizzlies, Dutch recruited 4 new gang members. First came Lenny Summers and Charles Smith, and then we have a woman called Jenny Kirk. Finally, Dutch recruited a creepy fellow by the name of Micah Bell. He was a hothead and a complete maniac, but he did save Dutch's life after a big deal with the locals went sour, and as an expression of his gratitude, Dutch offered Micah to join the gang, and the rest is history. It can be argued that Micah's arrival is what began the downfall of the Vanderlyn gang. First, he convinced Dutch to rob a riverboat in Blackwater, and while this would have been a pretty good haul as the riverboat was carrying $150,000 of cash from the bank, it also put the gang into a position that would make them easy targets for an ambush. This is exactly what happened when they were surrounded by a large group of Pinkerton agents right as they were walking out with the money. How did the Pinkertons know the riverboat was going to be robbed? It isn't clear, but there is a big possibility that the bank was using this riverboat as bait, and it wasn't uncommon for railway companies, banks, and industries to hire the Pinkerton agency for security back then, so this could have been just another routine job. Ultimately though, it ended very badly for the Vanderlyn gang. Arthur and Hosea, 2 of the gang's senior members, weren't even present for the robbery as they had their own lead for a different robbery. The remaining members got into an unwinnable gunfight and had to escape, but not everybody made it out alive. John was injured, although his wounds were nothing compared to Mac and Davy Callender, 2 brothers the gang had recruited a few years ago. Jenny was also shot by the Pinkertons, and she succumbed to her injuries before the gang made it to the mining town of Coulter, which is the snow-covered level where the game actually begins.
Now we've had, well, a bad couple of days. I loved Davy, Jenny, Sean, Mac. They might be okay. We don't know. But we lost some folks.
Almost the entirety of Red Dead Redemption 2, the gang is fleeing from one town to another, away from the Pinkertons. And as we learn later, there's a rat within the gang. A rat called Micah Bell. What you may not know is that Micah also had a brother called Amos. He ran with Micah's gang for a short while before resigning from the outlaw life and settling down in California with his wife. After separating from Amos, Micah met 2 other outlaws, Cleet and Joe. In 1899, after joining the Vanderlyn gang, he tried to sweet-talk his way to the top. More established members of the gang like Arthur and John viewed Micah as an unreliable, hot-headed show-off who couldn't think more than 2 steps ahead. But in reality, Micah was far more cunning than any of the gang members realized. From the beginning, it was his goal to replace Arthur and John as the lieutenants of the gang. He understood that Dutch was a greedy person who could be manipulated into taking great risks, and that's how Micah got him to sign off on the Blackwater heist. Nobody else in the gang thought it was a good idea, but Micah convinced Dutch to go ahead with it. Arthur always suspected that Micah would sell out the gang to save his own hide, and his fears came true after they returned from Guarma. This is when Micah defected to the Pinkertons, acting as a double agent for them. Whether he did it to save himself or steal the gang's money is unclear. Maybe it's a bit of both. Ultimately though, Micah's betrayal and Arthur's death led John to embark on his quest for revenge in the epilogue. After getting a tip from Sadie on Micah's location in 1907, John tracks him down and kills him. He also finds Dutch there, who is really just a shell of his former self, as he silently walks away after helping John kill Micah. That same year, Agent Edgar Ross is inducted into the newly formed Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the modern FBI. He's on the hunt for the remaining members of the Van der Linde gang, and he finds Micah's dead body on top of Mount Hagen, which leads him straight to John's ranch in Beecher's Hope. 4 years later, federal agents take John's family away from him and hold them hostage to force John into hunting down members of his former gang. And this is where the story of the first Red Dead Redemption begins. So, did you learn anything new about the characters of Red Dead Redemption 2? I find it amazing how Rockstar worked backwards in time to create this amazing world while providing much needed context for characters from the first game like Dutch and Javier. Arthur is both a brother as well as a mentor to John, and it's so cool to see his transformation from a selfish loner into a legendary outlaw. Who's your favorite character in Red Dead Redemption 2? Let me know in those comments. As always, I will see you guys in the next video. Adios, amigos.